Historically speaking, I'm Matt Ryan, and this is our look at the secret first national wrestling promotion that was before the other secret national wrestling promotion known as the International Wrestling Alliance and International Championship Wrestling. When we last left off, Pedro Martinez was out of the NWA. The NWA had to sign a consent decree after one of its greatest and most adulterous promoters sang to the FBI after getting blackballed from the Alliance for wanting to run shows in his old markets after Toots Mondt screwed him over by imploding the Manhattan booking agency. And now Johnny Doyle and Jim Barnett, the man Fred Kohler trusted with his business, now looking to take over the Midwest and soon the country following Barnett's taking over Indianapolis and now Cincinnati. They foiled the Barnett-Doyle Corporation on March 31st, 1959, each man owning 150 shares of the common stock, with 700 shares being held as a front for various other investors, including NWA First Vice President Frank Tunney and NWA President Sam Muchnick. Barnett would not take Cincinnati without a fight from promoter Al Haft, as the NWA-linked promoter wanted what was due to him as a dues-paying member of the organization of legitimate businessmen who are doing legitimate business for a totally real sport where all the transactions outside of television deals are done in cash. Anybody else want to watch Casino right now all of a sudden? And while there was no house in New Orleans, the sun was certainly rising for Barnett and Doyle, despite the red-blooded American capitalists looking to use collectivization and corporate socialism to debilitate any competition that looked to disrupt their gerrymandering of pro wrestling in North America. The popularity of Barnett and Doyle's product did not get past the evolving wrestling press, as Barnett would be featured in a column for Wrestling Life, this article shared by Arcadian Vanguard founder Brian Last.
Pro Wrestling's Ohio Mecca. Exclusive story for Wrestling Life by Howie Newstate. Prior to January 1959, pro wrestling in Cincinnati was surviving, but that was about all. Suddenly there appeared upon the scene a dynamic young promotional genius from Chicago by the name of Jim Barnett. Thus did it come about that in November of 1958, what could be categoried as one of the most historic sports meetings of all time took place, when young Mr. Barnett sat down in the plush Cincinnati Gardens conference room on the second floor of the huge, beautiful red brick edifice, and engaged his mighty sportatorium's top brass, Tom Grace, and its executive vice president / general manager Alex Sinclair in excited conversation regarding the Garden's excellent potential for becoming the capital of pro wrestling in the great state of Ohio. Already having an outstanding, truly fantastic string of promotional successes behind him, stretching from Detroit, Michigan, to Indianapolis, with additional financial interest atop it in all other major pro wrestling hotbeds, Barnett elaborated at great length about the tremendous map potential of Cincinnati and how it could indeed, according to his calculations, take its rightful place as one of America's centers of big-time wrestling, along with other inspired metropolises such as New York, Chicago, Detroit, Omaha, Atlanta, and Indianapolis. Although Mr. Grace and Mr. Sinclair were hesitant to foresee any long-range pro wrestling interest in Cincinnati, they believed Mr. Barnett had every capability and prominent stars at his disposal to produce a miracle in their gardens for a little while at least. The little while is still going strong, now finishing its second fantastic record-shattering year without any doubt of contradiction. Pro wrestling achieved phenomenal national prestige in the Cincinnati Gardens. In its first year officially, January 23rd, 1959, the date of the first major Cincinnati Gardens pro wrestling card, through December 26, 1959, the last major show in 1959, a frenzied 100,000 patrons paid nearly $185,000 to view 17 Barnett productions. Among the 17 super spectacular attractions, one among them a tag match on the date of March 7, 1959, between Angelo Poffo and Bronco Lubitsch versus Wilbur Snyder and Yukon Eric, drew the all-time Garden record attendance, 15,299 fans, with $25,402 in gross receipts. In addition to the agile, brilliant mind of Mr. Barnett engineering the exposure of Americans' greatest wrestling stars in the Cincinnati Gardens with uncanny skill, one additional facet of the operation helped achieve the overall record-shattering success of the promotion: television. In the words of Garden's general manager Alex Sinclair, we have to thank the televised studio wrestling every week for the big wrestling boom in the Gardens that, together with the guiding promotional ability of Mr. Barnett, gave us the nucleus with which we achieved success and put pro wrestling into the limelight in Cincinnati. Since the inaugural telecast of studio wrestling bouts at WCPO TV studios in Cincinnati on December 27th of 1958, Station officials claim that week after week the show has consistently maintained a high program rating. Just how big is pro wrestling in Cincinnati? Well, to quote one glaring official statistic, pro wrestling outdrew professional basketball, that's Cincinnati Royals in the Cincinnati Gardens, by some 59,000 paid admissions in 1959. How's it going in 1960? Through December 3rd, 1960, with one more super spectacular show to go before the year's end, 23 super spectaculars have soared the Garden's wrestling attendance to a new one-year all-time record high of 120,000 paid admissions. 20,000 ahead of 1959. Barnett is happy. Sinclair and Grace are happy. And most important of all, Cincinnati's thousands upon thousands of wrestling fans are delirious with joy. It couldn't happen to a better state.
The power of television was something both Barnett and Doyle knew were vital to the success of their promotion's expansion, and may have tried to skirt the NWA's issues with nationally televised programming with their regional/local studio programming as they grew from beyond Ohio into the Detroit area with a studio show in Windsor, Ontario, after either buying the Detroit territory from Harry Light and Jack Britton or running opposition to Harry Light and Jack Britton. The research on this is a little muddled from what I've seen, but if you know better, let us know in the comments. The first studio show would take place on March 3rd, 1959, with Dick the Bruiser and Wilbur Snyder on the card, and the Barnett-Doyle contingent producing and broadcasting the first episode of their version of Big Time Wrestling, which not only was the name of the preceding show promoted by Harry Light, but a common show title across the country at the time. The first TV would build up to a debut just over 1 month later on April 11th of 1959, as 16,226 humans would pay $40,000, which in 2025 money would be $435,317.24 in the first arena event in Detroit since May 24th, 1956, breaking the indoor gate record for Detroit at the time. The initial investment of Barnett and Doyle's venture of $18,000, or modern money $195,892.76, doubled on the first night of running a major arena. That is an insane stat for any era of the pro wrestling business, to build that much of a house in a market with a semblance of competition with just a month of television. But therein lies the power of TV, especially during the 1950s in a major market like Detroit, to not only draw that big of an audience, build off of it with talents like Dick the Bruiser, Bob Ellis, Vern Gagne, Hans Schmidt, and Angelo Poffo. And now let's go back to that night for a report from the Detroit Free Press via the History of Pro Wrestling in Windsor, Ontario Facebook group.
Wrestling the Rage, 16,226 pack Olympia to see groaners. In case you didn't know, wrestling has a real hammerlack on some fans in these parts. Look what happened Saturday night when an indoor program was launched at Olympia. Although there's been no big-time wrestling activity in Detroit in years, matchmakers Jim Barnett and Johnny Doyle encountered an astonishing hit. Fans, not the athletes, made the real news. The card drew 16,226 paid spectators. They poured $40,394.25 into the box office, the largest gross for an indoor wrestling show in Michigan history. Only twice as the Olympia handled more mat fans. This was back in the same era when the fire laws about standees were not so stringent. All seats were gone shortly after 8 o'clock, a half hour before the action began. An extra 1,000 standing room tickets were placed on sale and quickly gobbled up. Finally, the windows were closed, turning away many would-be spectators. It could have been a golden night for scalpers. No one, however, had expected anything like this. The opportunity will come. Barnett and Doyle have another card scheduled for May 2nd, but don't be surprised if the timetable is cranked up a bit after what happened Saturday. Oh yes, villain Angelo Poffo took 2 out of 3 falls from hero Wilbur Snyder, while police and ushers kept fervent members of the audience from getting into the act.
The two men would split their responsibilities in the organization, as Barnett would operate out of the Indianapolis area via Lexington, Kentucky, and Doyle would live with his wife Marge in Detroit. Dick the Bruiser would be their AWA United States champion, once again not looking to draw the ire of the NWA, while being an unaffiliated promotion still in the midst of strife in Ohio and Detroit. It would be the Barnett and Doyle tandem that would develop the idea of a dominant heel champion and the concept of a babyface chasing him, hoping to one day turn the tide tide, as Bruiser would see his friend and Doyle protege Wilbur Snyder become the foil a la Mad Dog Buzz Sawyer and Tommy Rich just over 20 years later on WTBS.
Weighing 250 pounds, Dick the Bruiser. In the same corner, from Stockholm, Sweden, weighing 275 pounds, Carl Carlson. Their opponents on this side of the ring, from Van Nuys, California, weighing 240 pounds, Wilbur Snyder. His partner, and also in the same corner, from Minneapolis, Minnesota, weighing 224 pounds, Vern Gagne. And the referee, Fred Leaderboard.
While Barnett and Doyle were not looking to rankle any of the NWA's hockles, during an interview with Raymond D. Hunter from the Department of Justice on May 18, 1959, inside the Claridge Hotel in St. Louis, NWA President Sam Muchnick complained about TV studio wrestling, according to Hunter's summary to Earl A. Jenkinson, the chief of the Midwest office. Muchnick stated in this connection that much promotional work was being done by promoters who are not confined to specific territories, and these promoters will enter into contracts with wrestlers for exhibitions and thereafter contract with TV studios for TV time, and then sell the rebroadcast of such exhibitions to advertisers. Muchnick noted that it was easy for a promoter to obtain a license to stage shows in various states, thus making it possible for a single promoter to run shows with contracted wrestlers across a much wider percentage of the country. The NWA Don wanted some regulation with respect to promoters televising wrestling exhibitions via tape programs, which had previously been filmed in TV studios, according to Hunter's report. In this connection, he states that this type of exhibition hurts the wrestling as a whole, that when such programs are taped and rebroadcast on nights when there are live exhibitions, they interfere with attendance at such live exhibitions, particularly when named TV wrestlers are on the card. Now, if you're a sports fan, like me, you know this is the same bullshit excuse used by the NFL, the NBA, the NHL, and the MLB during this time and for several decades after, utilizing the blackout rule. And as we heard earlier, this is a bunch of bullshit. The shows in Detroit and Cincinnati were record gates and would establish the template of success that the wrestling business would follow for the next 25 years. But since it's an openly gay guy and the person who snitched on their little scam, even though they never really got into trouble, they're going to try to keep him out of their little club. But the best rib of all is, remember how Muchnick was an early silent partner in the business? He had points in the Indianapolis office, which was one of the TV strongholds he was bitching about. God, this business is frustrating. What isn't frustrating is the dope messages that are coming in from people listening and watching the show. ECW and ROH Original and my good personal longtime friend HC Loke shouted me out on Facebook this week, and I wanted to thank him for that and his continued friendship and support. I also wanted to shout out my friends at the Business of the Business podcast, Lavi and John, who had me on this past week to talk about the show and the state of the pro wrestling business, and I try not to look like a douchebag on camera. You can hear that on PW Ponderings or the Creative Control Podcast Network. And despite Muchnick saying what he said to the Department of Justice and NWA bookers not wanting to deal with Barnett and Doyle, especially those dealing with them as opposition in different markets, Muchnick was a supporter of bringing them into the NWA. I guess it's the enemy you know against the enemy you don't know. And even though they'd have a supporter in this NWA president, they somehow lost an ally in Fred Kohler, who would go from using Barnett and Doyle's talent for Chicago and instead going to Doyle's old business partners, Vince McMahon and Toots Mondt, for their wrestlers from the DC area. Whether it was due to geography or economy, there would be some idea of peace between the two, because the article on Barnett, which was in Wrestling Life that we just read a little earlier, was published by Kohler. But by the time Kohler took over for Muchnick as NWA president in 1961, there was heat. A lot of heat. Kohler wouldn't be the only one getting in with McMahon and Toots Mondt, because the former business partners of Doyle would come after him by partnering with the guy he was feuding with in Detroit, Harry Light. McMahon and Mondt would send Bruno Sammartino, Antonino Rocca, Don Curtis, Mark Lewin, Angelo Savoldi, and Haystacks Calhoun for the greatest card ever presented in Detroit. That took place on October 7th, 1961, inside the Olympia. A week later, in the Cobo Arena, which is where Doyle and Barnett would move their shows, Barnett and Doyle would feature Gagne, Dick the Bruiser, Wilbur Snyder, Bearcat Wright, Fritz Von Erich, Bobo Brazil, and Bob Ellis. The collection of names that Detroit wrestling would get in a random week in October in 1961 is insane. And the ability to get that amount of talent from all those different offices that you're running to run opposition to the biggest brand and the biggest booking office looking to throw everything they have at you. Doyle and Barnett were not fucking around. And by 1961, they were not only promoting in Detroit and Indianapolis and Cincinnati, but Denver since 59, New Orleans in 60, after starting in Louisiana as far back as 1958 before their official partnership began, working with Don McIntyre, and Evansville, Indiana, in partnership with Muchnick, Tampa, Florida, Atlanta, Georgia, Minneapolis, Minnesota, Omaha, Nebraska, and Charlotte, North Carolina with Big Jim Crockett. These were all the territories that Barnett and Doyle were promoting, running shows, and running TVs out of. These are the strongholds of professional wrestling for decades to come. Tampa, Atlanta, Minneapolis, Charlotte. Those are the wrestling cities. New Orleans, Denver was a huge city. Detroit, Indianapolis, Cincinnati was a huge city in wrestling wars that would go into the 1980s. They were a big part of WTBS. But back to our story, on top of the studio aspect that Barnett and Doyle perfected and crafted, and the heel-heavy championship promotion to have the babyface chase, Doyle's shows were heavy on squash matches. So that squash style of television that we were used to up until 32 years ago was to build anticipation for the arena matches, because you would see wrestling every week on TV, but maybe at the arena once a month at the big shows. So it was trying to show people a walking advertisement for what you could see in the big matches at the arenas. It's amazing logic, and much like we spoke about last time, Doyle was not done trying to piss in the boots of the Hollywood booking office, but would not only look to take Southern California, but take the whole state, utilizing one of he and Barnett's fastest rising stars, Roy Shire. And I love how the powerful combos of the 1950s and 60s, Doyle and Barnett, McMahon and Mondt, set the tone and established the coaching trees for what wrestling would look like over the next half century. With Mondt's institutional memory, McMahon's connections and ability to build partnerships with networks and promoters, against Doyle and Barnett's thirst for growth, their innovations built off the back of local TV, and also their impressive roster of talent and their ability to draw houses, you really start to see the roots of modern pro wrestling really take hold as the prodigies and progenies of these different booking offices would cross-pollinate across the country and start to fill a lot of the gaps into the 1970s and 80s. But back to the Golden State is by 1960, the man who opened up San Francisco had been 2 years removed from leaving the NWA with lacking TV and declining houses, and that was Joe Malkowitz. With the how of it all not really clear, Shire would either be sent by Barnett and Doyle, or he went to Barnett with the idea as the promoters would fund and Barnett would negotiate a TV time slot for Shire every Friday night on KTVU Channel 2 in Oakland, with the major sponsor being Jim Westman's Bay Area Gateway Chevrolet. Shire would follow the Barnett-Doyle model of developing TV starting in February of 61, building to a March 4th, 1961 event at the Cow Palace for a house of 16,553 humans and a gate of 48,991, which is well over $500,000 in 2025 money. Malkowitz would run an event 2 days later, but feature a paltry crowd of 2,841 people. The biggest draw for Shire that night was Mitsu Arakawa and Bill Melby, but for the long term, it would be the man that he teamed with for Barnett and Doyle in Indianapolis, Ray Stevens. And while Stevens would become the god of Northern California wrestling for the next 20 years, Doyle was still looking to take back control of the city of movie stars and bright lights. But before Doyle could get back home to Los Angeles, the man who took over LA, Jules Strongbow, was no longer in the NWA himself, creating the NAWA, built around his world champion Edward Carpentier, with Strongbow looking to replicate what Toots Mondt did in 1938, with a booking office in Southern California, running shows in San Francisco, Arizona, Nevada, the Pacific Northwest, Hawaii, and the JWA in Japan. With McMahon and Mondt partnering with Kohler in Chicago and looking to take over the entire East Coast in Canada after ripping back control of Madison Square Garden, and also the impending Doyle-Barnett concern, Strongbow looked wise for trying to load up against potential consolidation with, or against, or by the NWA. Strongbow would align with Malkowitz in the latter's war against Shire, as LA would Carpentier, Freddie Blassie, and Dick Hutton, along with Strongbow helping book the cards. But a big thing would be the legendary Ad Santel and his son making the jump to the Shire office, which would set up a chain of events which by October of 61 would see Shire retire Malkowitz. In LA, it was a bit of a different story. Doyle would prepare for his return to Los Angeles after a freezing rain would hamper a Bobo Brazil and Dick the Bruiser match in Tiger Stadium on June 23, 1961, where 11,000 people would attend for a gate of 38,866, which in 2025 is a really respectable $411,620.94, which would have been a great house at the Cobo or the Olympia. But at Tiger Stadium, when they were hoping for the next $100,000 gate after what Doyle was able to do in Los Angeles, it was a failure. And following that Tiger Stadium showdown, another showdown would go down in August of 1961 at the annual NWA convention, when Doyle and Barnett would become a pawn in the issues between Kohler and Muchnick. Because Muchnick approved Doyle and Barnett going into the alliance, even though the NWA would say that's a direct violation of their bylaws because Muchnick did it out of session. Doyle and Barnett were going to sue, but they'd be talked out of it, even though Doyle would go to the DOJ and nothing would come out of that. Looked like the well was dry on government getting involved in pro wrestling by this point. Undeterred, and with the legendary Dick Lane behind the mic on the powerhouse channel KTLA Channel 5 in LA.
Who else could it be but the late Dick Lane, the man whose voice and style and humor added as much to wrestling on television as the wrestlers themselves. Dick presented the matches with a perfect blend of make-believe and reality, and when it came to verbal clinches, he could hold his own with the biggest bullies on the tube.
Now we are ready, but very ready, for the main event of the evening. And now coming into our view is the Continental Nobleman, the Brute of Abruzzi, the Baron Michel Leone. Dressed tonight in a tunic of pale blue, sort of an aquamarine blue, with an underskirting of darker blue, navy blue, with the crest of the family of Leone on the chest.
Johnny Doyle would return to producing wrestling in Los Angeles on October 3rd, 1961. But instead of fighting his old enemy Cal Eaton, it would be Jules Strongbow, his old star, standing across from him in the metaphorical ring of promotion. Strongbow would fight dirty off the jump, booking a super show the night before Doyle's debut at the Los Angeles Sports Arena. On October 6, 1961, Strongbow would book Freddie Blassie defending his WWA World title. It was changed to the WWA from NAWA at this point, against Ricky Starr, and an undercard that featured Lou Thez, Antonino Rocca, Mike Sharp, the Torres brothers, Mr. Moto, Fritz Von Goring, Art Thomas, Fred Atkins, Leo Garibaldi, Gene LaBelle, and Giant fucking Baba. This show drew 12,138 fans and a gate of $32,530, or $342,221.02 in 2025 money. The next night, Snyder and Doyle would see 4,000 for a card where Ray Stevens would defeat Ray Thunder Stern, not Howard's mother Ray, but R-A-Y. The card would also feature Bobo Brazil, Red Bastien, Dick the Bruiser, Cowboy Bob Ellis, Killer Kowalski, Pepper Gomez, and Shire, who rarely worked on his own cards, alongside Don Leo Jonathan, Wilbur Snyder, and Japanese stars Mitsu Arakawa and Kenji Shibuya, who were on the card as well. Round 2 of the war would be the final one, as Strongbow would return to the Olympic Auditorium where it was cheaper and draw a house with Blassie defeating Rock in front of 8,860 fans for a gate of $16,100, or in modern money, $169,374.68. The next night would prove to be the swan song for Doyle in California, as only 3,500 fans would come to the Los Angeles Sports Arena to see Ray Stevens defeat Bobo Brazil. After this, Fresno would become the dividing line between Northern California promotion and Southern California promotion. And honestly, everybody kind of got along after that, to be completely honest with you. But the next time on Historically Speaking, we look at the final act of Barnett and Doyle's tandem in the United States, the reasons that they may have made a move, and the national wrestling promotion they started that redefined American wrestling for decades to come from several continents away. Historically Speaking is a production of the Intergalactic Sports Network and is produced by Ember Media. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you are, and we'll see you next week. Bye!